Tourist shot dead on South Africa safari after guide's firearm accidentally discharges at Kruger National Park. A Canadian tourist has been killed during a safari trip in South Africa's world famous Kruger National Park after a firearm accidentally discharged during an outing led by a private guide. Now we explore the truth, the mystery, and every detail of this story on our AI podcast.
Book a high-end luxury vacation, especially something deeply adventurous like an African safari, you are essentially buying this like invisible, impenetrable bubble.
Right, you're paying for the illusion.
Exactly. You want the visceral thrill of the wild, you want the roar of a lion to physically rattle your chest, and you want the dust of the savannah on your boots.
But subconsciously, there's a massive, meticulously engineered logistical machine keeping you perfectly safe.
Right, it's a curated thrill. The danger is supposed to stay out there, strictly on the other side of the Jeep door. You feel entirely secure. Well, until that bubble bursts.
Because the threat doesn't always come from the wild environment you paid to observe. Sometimes the threat is actually introduced from inside the bubble itself.
Yeah. So today on our deep dive, our mission is to uncover how that illusion of security shatters. We want to look at what happens when the mechanisms we rely on for protection become, well, the very things that destroy us.
And we have some really intense source material for this one. We're using official police statements, incident reports from South African national parks, and legal filings.
Yeah, these are detailing a shocking, fatal incident at the world-famous Kruger National Park.
We are looking at a localized tragedy, right? A fatal firearm accident involving a tourist and a private safari guide. But it's one of those events that immediately cracks open massive structural questions.
The questions about, like, public-private oversight, right?
Exactly. And the psychology of risk in the hospitality industry, plus a much broader security crisis that's currently plaguing one of the most famous wildlife reserves on Earth.
Okay, let's unpack this. We need to start by examining the exact mechanics of this tragedy, how a highly structured leisure activity turned fatally chaotic in, just a matter of seconds.
Yeah, the details are pretty sobering.
The incident centers on a 69-year-old Canadian man. He is traveling through Kruger with a tour group, and, at that state of life, you can safely assume this is a bucket list trip.
Oh, absolutely. It's a massive investment of time, money, and most importantly, trust.
Trust is the operative word there. You are completely outsourcing your survival to experts.
Right, because you have to.
So the group spends the afternoon doing standard game viewing, which is, the whole point of Kruger. But as the day winds down, they transition to an activity known as a bush braai.
Essentially, it's a sunset barbecue set up directly inside the reserve.
Yeah, and it is designed to be incredibly picturesque. You are sitting out under the African sky, the sun is setting, you have food and drinks, but you are highly vulnerable.
Very vulnerable. You are out of the vehicle on foot.
Right, in an environment where apex predators are actively waking up for the night.
Which is precisely why an armed guide is a non-negotiable requirement for an event like this. You are relying on a professional carrying a heavy caliber rifle.
A rifle specifically designed to stop a charging animal in its tracks.
Exactly.
But the unthinkable happens. That rifle, held by the private safari guide, unintentionally discharges. The bullet strikes the 69-year-old tourist directly in the chest. Fellow group members, along with paramedics who are rushed to the location, they immediately attempt emergency first aid.
But the trauma is just too severe. The man is pronounced dead at the scene.
It's just horrifying. And, when you hear about a tourist dying on an African safari, your immediate assumption is always a wild animal attack, right? Like a lion or an elephant.
Naturally, yeah. That's what you're braced for.
But the shocking reality here is that the lethal threat was actually the very tool brought along to protect the guests.
What's fascinating here is how quickly this tragedy exposes the layered operational architecture of a modern megapark like Kruger.
What do you mean by that?
Well, when a visitor looks around Kruger, they see uniforms, they see rangers, and they naturally assume everyone works under a single unified chain of command run by the state.
Like it's all one big company.
Right. But the official statements from Sandpark spokesperson J.P. Lau immediately complicated that narrative. He had to publicly clarify a vital distinction.
That the guide holding the rifle was not a park employee.
Exactly.
Yeah, I was looking into the mechanics of these private concession permits, and it's a remarkably complex system. You have Sandparks, the state authority, managing the land, anti-poaching efforts, and overall conservation.
But they lease out operational rights to private companies.
Right. This specific tour group actually booked their safari outside the park boundaries. The private company they hired simply held a specialized concession permit to bring guests across the boundary line specifically for this sunset braai.
It is a public-private partnership built for economic efficiency.
Makes sense on paper, I guess.
Yeah, the state brings in revenue through permits without having to micromanage all the hospitality logistics. But that layered system heavily dilutes the chain of responsibility.
Ah, right. So when a catastrophic failure occurs, the state can immediately point out that the failure happened under the private operator's jurisdiction.
Exactly. Sandparks express their condolences naturally, but legally and operationally, they are drawing a hard line. They're saying this was a private employee.
Which isolates the focus squarely onto the specific protocols of that private company and, the specific actions of that guide.
Right.
And that brings us to the actual mechanics of the discharge. How does a modern, meticulously engineered firearm just go off?
Yeah, that's the big question.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and I mean that with a profound sense of grim disbelief. According to police spokesperson Colonel Mavela Masondo, the initial findings indicate the tourist approached the guide and asked him a simple question.
He asked whether the rifle he was holding was real.
And the police report states the discharge occurred during what they describe as an attempt to demonstrate the firearm.
Just unbelievable.
Let's stop and really look at the physical mechanics of what that means, because modern rifles, they don't just fire on their own.
No, they absolutely do not.
For a gun to go off, a specific sequence of mechanical safeties have to be bypassed or ignored. I kind of think of it like the strict rules on a movie set with prop guns, You don't just wave them around.
Right, there are layers of safety.
First, there has to be a live round actively chambered. Second, the mechanical safety catch has to be disengaged.
And third, something has to physically depress the trigger.
Right. So you were describing a cascading failure of fundamental tactical discipline.
Exactly. It's baffling that a loaded, lethal weapon in the wild was handled so casually just to prove its authenticity, treating a deadly tool like a mere tourist attraction.
I keep thinking about this like a pilot who is suddenly asked to act as a flight attendant mid-flight.
That's a good analogy.
The guide is straddling two totally opposed professions. On one hand, he is a hospitality worker. His instinct is to be gracious, to entertain, to answer questions, to give the guest a memorable, tactile experience. Is the gun real? Sure, let me show you.
But on the other hand, he is essentially functioning as an armed security contractor in a hazardous environment.
Right, which requires a totally different mindset.
That role requires rigid, uncompromising adherence to protocol. You treat every weapon as if it is loaded. You never point the muzzle at anything you are not willing to destroy.
And you keep your finger completely off the trigger until you are ready to fire.
Exactly. The mindset required to be a good host fundamentally compromise the rigid focus required to handle a lethal tool.
He tried to combine the two, treating a heavy caliber rifle. A tool engineered strictly to kill massive animals like a souvenir, like a prop for a show and tell session.
This raises an important question about a psychological phenomenon known as the normalization of deviance.
The normalization of deviance, what's that?
Well, when you carry a high-powered rifle every single day for years, and you rarely, if ever, actually have to fire it at a charging animal, your brain recalibrates.
Oh, I see.
The weapon stops feeling like a live explosive. It starts feeling like a heavy walking stick. It just becomes a piece of your daily wardrobe.
Oh, yeah.
That normalization breeds a subtle complacency, which is how you end up casually handling a loaded weapon in a crowd of civilians to prove it isn't a toy.
And the legal system has a very specific way of dealing with that complacency. Authorities haven't charged him with murder. They have opened cases of culpable homicide and reckless handling of a firearm.
That distinction is paramount in the South African legal framework. Murder requires explicit intent. It requires malice.
Right, you have to want to kill the person.
The state acknowledges that the guide did not wake up with the desire to shoot a tourist, but culpable homicide addresses the unlawful, negligent killing of a human being.
So it's kind of similar to vehicular manslaughter.
Functionally, yes. When a professional introduces a lethal tool into an environment filled with untrained civilians, their duty of care is absolute.
So the reckless handling charge is about the demonstration itself.
Exactly. The charge of reckless handling legally codifies the idea that the demonstration itself was a crime. By merely attempting to manipulate a loaded weapon for a non-tactical reason in close proximity to a guest, the guide violated the core tenets of his permit.
Because the negligence was just so severe.
So completely outside the bounds of standard operating procedure, that it overrides the lack of intent. It doesn't matter that he didn't mean to do it. The law says he created the conditions where it was bound to happen.
It really makes you question the systemic oversight. If private companies are operating under these concession permits, who is auditing their internal training?
That's the million-dollar question right now.
I mean, a state park ranger goes through rigorous, standardized paramilitary training. Is the private guide running the Sunset Variety held to that exact same standard? Or are there blind spots in how these permits are regulated?
Clearly there are blind spots because this one moment of casual handling ended a man's life.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the authorities do not have the luxury of viewing this as an isolated incident. It is immediately feeding into a much larger, darker narrative concerning the entire region.
Let's expand on that macro context. Because Kruger National Park is not just a patch of woods. We are talking about an expanse of approximately 7,500 square miles.
It's massive.
That is roughly the size of the state of New Jersey, or the entire country of Israel. It is an absolutely staggering amount of land to police, and it attracts over 1 million visitors annually.
It is the economic heartbeat of that entire province and a massive pillar of South Africa's international tourism revenue. Millions of livelihoods depend directly or indirectly on the park functioning smoothly.
But the official reports we are reading explicitly state that this accidental shooting is exacerbating already severe concerns about safety in and around the park.
Yeah, the timing is really bad.
And that is because, just a month prior, a married couple, aged 71 and 73, were brutally murdered in a separate attack near the park boundaries.
The details of that prior incident are deeply disturbing. The elderly couple was discovered in a river, and their hands had been bound.
That's awful.
It was a targeted, premeditated crime. Suspects linked to those murders have been tracked down and arrested across multiple international borders, including South Africa, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe. Extradition proceedings are currently active.
Okay, wait, hold on. I have to interject here, because I think we need to challenge the narrative being constructed by these official statements.
Go ahead.
So what does this all mean? We are talking about a guide making a catastrophic, negligent mistake with a rifle during a barbecue versus an international, highly organized criminal syndicate executing an elderly couple.
Right.
Why are official reports putting these in the same conversation? Are we just conflating two totally distinct categories of danger just because they share the same geographical zip code?
It's a fair question.
It almost feels like park authorities are using this accident to blur the lines and distract from their inability to secure the borders from actual cartels. Or is there a legitimate, overarching safety crisis?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, your pushback is entirely valid from a criminological standpoint. Functionally and legally, internal protocol negligence and external premeditated murder are completely different threats requiring completely different systemic solutions.
Right. One is a training issue, the other is a border security issue.
Exactly. But you have to look at this through the lens of macroeconomics and human psychology.
How so?
Think about the consumer. The million tourists flying in from Canada, Europe, the US, or Asia. For an economy so heavily reliant on those international dollars, the commodity they are actually selling isn't just wildlife.
No.
No, they are selling the perception of safety. They are selling that invisible bubble we talked about earlier.
Oh, I see. Right. If you don't feel safe, you just don't book the ticket.
Precisely. Human psychology doesn't neatly parse legal definitions when evaluating threat levels. When a potential tourist opens a newspaper or checks their feed, they don't delineate between culpable homicide by a private concessionaire and first-degree murder by an international syndicate.
They just see the headline.
Right. Their brain simply categorizes all of it under a giant flashing red light that says, tourists are dying at Kruger.
Wow. So the threat vectors are different, but the economic consequence is identical.
Exactly. When the official police and park reports themselves note that this shooting compounds existing safety concerns, it reveals a profound anxiety at the institutional level.
They know they're in trouble.
The authorities know they are fighting a multi-front war for public trust. On one front, they have to police a 7,500 square mile porous border against organized criminals operating out of Mozambique and Zimbabwe.
Which is incredibly difficult.
And simultaneously, on the internal front, they have to ensure that every single private guide working for a third-party contractor is treating their equipment with flawless tactical discipline.
It is a logistical nightmare. I mean, you can build the most robust anti-poaching and border security force in the world to keep the criminals out, But it doesn't matter if the guy you hire to cook the barbecue inside the fence accidentally shoots the guest.
Which highlights why the current ongoing investigation into the specific firearm handling protocols of these private safaris is so critical.
Right, they have to figure this out.
It isn't just about prosecuting one guide for culpable homicide. It is about auditing the entire public-private concession model to prove to the international community that the internal bubble is actually sound.
Because if the international community stops believing in the bubble, the tourists go elsewhere.
Yes, and if the tourists go elsewhere, the revenue that funds the massive conservation efforts protecting the animals dries up entirely.
So the ecosystem itself relies on that perception of safety.
A single, completely preventable lapse in judgment has the potential to trigger an economic and ecological ripple effect across millions of acres.
It's really heavy when you think about it like that. To quickly distill the journey we've taken through these reports today, we started with the tragic, completely avoidable death of a 69-year-old tourist who was simply trying to experience the beauty of a sunset in the wild.
Yeah.
We broke down how that single gunshot exposed the complex, sometimes contradictory operational layers between state park authorities and private luxury operators.
And we examined the mechanical and psychological failures required for a lethal weapon to be treated like a casual novelty, leading to charges of culpable homicide.
Right. We analyzed the legal weight of introducing a firearm into a civilian setting where the duty of care absolutely overrides any lack of malicious intent.
And we zoomed out to look at the massive shadow cast over the region where a negligent accident and a brutal cartel murder merge in the public consciousness,
threatening the economic foundation of one of the world's most important wildlife reserves.
This raises a final provocative thought to consider, one that builds directly on the authorities' current scramble to investigate firearm protocols in these concession areas.
What's your takeaway?
We established early on that the fundamental premise of a private walking safari or a bush braai relies on the presence of a heavily armed guide.
Right, you need the gun.
The high-caliber rifle is introduced specifically to mitigate the risk of the natural environment. It is there to stop the lion, the leopard, or the elephant.
Yeah, that's its only purpose.
But if a tourist ends up bleeding out from a bullet wound due to the catastrophic human error of their own protector, we have to look at the raw statistics.
You mean the actual probabilities of danger?
Yes. Does the introduction of a loaded firearm into a highly social, hospitality-driven safari experience actually create a higher statistical risk of death to the tourist than the wild animals they originally came to observe?
Wow. That completely inverts the logic of the entire industry. You pay a premium to build an invisible, impenetrable bubble around yourself, assuming the ultimate danger is out there in the bush, stalking you in the dark.
Right.
But the brutal reality of human fallibility suggests that the deadliest element in the savannah might just be the very tool you brought inside the bubble to keep yourself alive.
It's a paradox of security that regulators, private operators, and future tourists will be forced to deeply reevaluate in the wake of this tragedy.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It is a sobering examination of how we interact with the wild, the fragility of the systems we trust to protect us, and the heavy burden of responsibility that comes with them. Keep questioning the structures around you, and we'll catch you next time.
Okay, one question for you. What safety protocols should be mandatory for private safari operators inside major wildlife reserves like Kruger National Park, especially when firearms are carried in close proximity to tourists during leisure activities such as sunset barbecues? Don't forget to comment it. Thanks.